Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elective representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow.
Welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here on this beautiful summer day. I have ditched the sports coat and I'm wearing a golf shirt today, and I am proud of it. It is just a wonderful summer so far. We have a very serious issue to talk about today, though, and that is the reversal of Roe v. Wade in the United States. And how is that connected with democratic backsliding? That is the erosion of democratic rights in so many countries, not only in the United States, but also in other countries. And I'll mention, for example, Poland will be one of the countries that I'll be talking about today. And so the concern really is that at the same time as we are seeing a backsliding of democracy and the erosion of democratic freedoms, we're also seeing women and sexual minority rights being adversely affected. And so really the question is this connected? Are these two phenomena interconnected? And I have three excellent guests today to discuss this. Gabrielle Bardall from Herizon Democracy, Hafsa Mohammad from Grassroots NB, and Carole Chan, a frequent contributor to the podcast from Democracy Now! So let's get started. Let me bring in Gabrielle Bardall from Herizon Democracy. Gabrielle, welcome to Politics and Public Finance.
Hi, Jeff. It's great to be here.
Give us an elevator pitch about what you do over at Herizon Democracy before we get started.
Absolutely. So Herizon Democracy is a private consulting practice where I work on projects supporting a feminist approach to democracy assistance, if you will, with international organizations, international nonprofits, and national electoral authorities, making sure that women's rights are a part of every step of the way for anything from disinformation work to political finance to gender quota design and other aspects of political participation.
Amazing. And before we start, I don't want to just pump out the first question. I want to start with a bit of a context, which is to say that I still remember, as a Canadian, obviously what happens in the U.S. It does reverberate here. We do tend to keep an eye on things. And I remember as a child coming home and watching on TV, and I have goosebumps as I'm talking about it, that Ronald Reagan having been shot. And that was a sort of where were you when moment. Well, I was at the gym when I saw the announcement on CNN. I think that's what they had on about the reversal of Roe versus Wade. And I think I'm always going to remember where I was when that happened. That was a very sad moment for women's rights and human rights in the United States and around the world. And I guess the theme that I want to talk about today is really about what seems to be a trend that we're seeing in many countries in the world, where women's rights and the curtailing of women's rights and the rights of sexual minorities seems to be connected to democratic backsliding. Why don't you share your opinion with me on sort of how you see that?
Yeah, well, I know exactly where I was when the Roe versus Wade decision came out, and it was a knife through the heart to see it, but it wasn't a surprise. And I think what we really...
No, it was leaked. It was leaked in advance.
Well, it was leaked, but it wasn't a surprise in the sense that we've been watching this happen every day of our lives for the last 20 years. The decision on Roe versus Wade was really just the latest and the most dramatic symptom of what's a chronic disease in the U.S. And I speak as both a Canadian and an American. This has been a long and coordinated campaign to restrict freedoms and to limit participation and leadership in the U.S. And it's a sad day to look at it here, just to our neighbors to the south, but it's identical to what we see from the revolution in Ukraine back in 2014 to Venezuela or Zimbabwe. This is a situation where effectively an elite class realizes that they can no longer maintain control of a country by building the legitimate support of a majority of the population through democracy, and they need to maintain control through exclusion. And that is where we're seeing these limitations and restrictions on democratic freedoms take place, and it is happening in the U.S. just as it's happening around the world. So the Roe versus Wade decision was the result of decades of stacking the courts, of limiting and restricting voting rights, of gerrymandering, political districting, of political finance management. And so it's not a surprise. And although we will remember where we were when that announcement came out, we should be asking, where were we when these rights were being eroding? And that's, that is why I do what I do.
That's amazing. Let's just go back to something you said. You mentioned Ukraine in 2014. I'm drawing a blank. I mean, I certainly am aware of the events in Ukraine, but in terms of in 2014, but in terms of the issue around gender and minority rights, can you maybe just fill in the blanks there for myself and the listeners?
Sure. So the Revolution of Dignity, it was called, the Euromaidan Revolution, was a turning point in Ukraine when the students, in particular, the population, rose up against what had become an oligarchy-based government, and ultimately ushered in a more democratic state, which is now under attack once again. This, to me, is a product of a deepening of inequality that has accelerated at an extraordinary pace over the last couple of decades, of changing demographics, new pressures from climate change, from ongoing conflict in different parts of the world that have put an incredible strain on what was effectively a relatively new and fragile third wave of democracy. And as a result, we are seeing autocrats who previously may have been kind of hiding in the shadows or pretending to be democracies, or what they call pseudo democracies or hybrid regimes. They're shaking off their masks and they're coming out for who they are, and they are showing their true colors as autocratic regimes that are openly hostile to democracy. We are seeing this in so many different ways, but in particular in terms of gender. And this, to me, is what's really fascinating. For so many years, it was an easy ride for autocrats who wanted to dress up as Democrats to say, hey, we're going to we're going to hold elections because that's what democracies do. We're going to advance women in politics because that's a sign of democracy. But in fact, they were using those things to manipulate. We all know how authoritarian regimes can manipulate elections. That's the type of things that's in the headlines every day. But we don't really think about how they manipulate gender rights. So look at gender quotas, for example. They're incredibly popular around the world. They're also really, really effective in getting more women into leadership positions, which is incredibly important. But they are suspiciously popular in authoritarian regimes, in single state regimes. Why? Because for so many years, dictators that were trying to dress up as democracies could have a gender quota, and it was win-win. They'd have more women in power, so it looked like they're a democracy. But it's a single party state. So all of those women were already supporting the autocratic regime. So in those contexts, women who spoke out, women who were dissidents, women who were opposition members were being systematically repressed in countries from Zimbabwe to Sri Lanka and beyond. But these autocrats were getting the cred for being better than they were. That's changing. We are now seeing more and more states come out and be openly hostile to gender equality and to women's rights. And that's also part of a broader strategy, which I'd be happy to chat about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think I referenced earlier in my sort of background notes to all the speakers today, all the guests, this article called Revenge of the Patriarchs, where the authors are arguing that women have powered social movements in a number of countries, including the US, Hong Kong, Russia, Turkey, and often the defeat of those movements, even in the short term, seems to lead to a patriarchal backlash among the autocrats. What are your thoughts on that? Do you agree with this?
Yeah, that's a great piece by Erica Chenoweth and Zoe Marks, wonderful authors and scholars on this topic. I study backlash, and I can talk more about that. But to me, the primary reason that autocratic states are attacking women's rights so overtly now is primarily strategic. These autocrats know that undermining gender equality, promoting sexism it's just effective political strategy. It builds social intolerance. It creates and fuels this fear of change and this sense of insecurity in a population, and that's what dictators thrive on: division, fear. When these folks, when these guys are assaulting women's rights, and when they are promoting all different forms of intolerance, whether it is gender inequality or homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, racism, all of it, those are the bricks on the road to autocracy. And for that reason, it really is quite a direct strategy. By creating social division, by creating intolerance, by fueling and stoking conflict domestically, this is how they're actually consolidating their control.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And actually, I'm going to pull out a surprise quote that I put on my iPhone when I was listening to a podcast the other day. And it's just one of those things you hear and it just blows you out of the water. So it was on the Lincoln Project. I don't know if you're familiar with. I suspect you are. Yeah. Sort of looking at the destruction of democracy in the United States in general and elsewhere. But they talk about, it's really about fascism. And it says fascism doesn't have a policy agenda. It has many hates. Right now, its agenda is directed at trans children. Before that, it was directed at undocumented folks. Before that, it was the Muslim ban. It's always mutating. The point is to have an enemy that frees you from having to think about yourself and your own losses and your own mistakes. How poignant do you think that is in light of what we're discussing on this podcast today?
Yeah, I think it's very pertinent. There are so many fears that dominate our lives today, our modern societies, and whether that's an advanced democracy or an emerging democracy, whether it is, again, this growing poverty gap, climate change, conflict, all of it, that passing the buck and looking for responsibility elsewhere is a way of internalizing that insecurity. But it's bigger than that. These are authoritarian rulers who are in control and who don't necessarily, or who don't at all, feel the need to look elsewhere to place the blame. They're looking for control. They're looking for power. They're looking for wealth. And by creating that sense of insecurity in the population, that's how they seize it and maintain it. And women's rights in particular are at the core of that. The notion of addressing historic inequalities that have provided security for dominant classes for so long is the definition of destabilizing, right? And the gender divide is the primary and the dominant inequality across the ages. And it defines all the other inequalities that exist in so many different ways. And so when that security blanket of inequality and repression is removed, that's when people start flailing. And that's essentially what is happening in this backlash that we're seeing in this populist movement in so many parts of the world that is looking back nostalgically on on a rosy and completely fabricated depiction of a past where
the good old days,
where a dominant class, a dominant race, a dominant sex lived a life of comfort at the cost of others.
And it's really interesting because, one of the examples that I tend to focus on because of the work that I've done in Eastern Europe previously, or where I started my career and did a lot of my academic studies many years ago, was Poland, for example, where, the ruling Law and Justice Party used a politically influenced constitutional tribunal to bypass proper parliamentary procedures in eliminating legal grounds for abortion. So that is, a good example of that confluence between undermining democracy or scaling back democracy and specifically targeting women's rights. I think this would be a great time to bring in our two other guests. So why don't we do that? Hafsa Mohammad and Carole Chan, it'd be great to have you join us. Welcome to Politics and Public Finance. Great to have you both here as well.
Good to be here.
And before we continue the conversation, why don't we do give you each the 10-second elevator pitch. Hafsa, you're with Grassroots NB. Why don't you give us the elevator pitch about what Grassroots NB does?
It's just a grassroots-led organization of people who come in and out completely fluid, where we share data and our stories and work together freely and fluidly.
Fantastic. And Carole Chan, Democracy Now! Elevator pitch.
So Democracy Now! Was born of a bunch of women who actually participated in a political campaign in 2020 already. And we wanted to create a space that we could support each other in future campaigns, future political engagement, I should say, not just election campaigns. And it's really an area where we can think about women's participation, or people who identify as women's participation in democracy. And it's frankly got me thinking about, does democracy actually support women generally in the iteration that we have, which I'm sure we'll discuss today.
I think that's exactly what we're going to talk about. And I should mention, Carole, that you're a frequent contributor to this podcast. So welcome back.
Thank you.
Hafsa, I'm going to start with you, and I'm just going to ask you to provide some general reaction and sort of commentary on what you've heard so far in the discussion with Gabrielle.
I thought it was really interesting. I think that there's some really interesting commentary being made about systems not actually supporting the masses because the nature of the masses have changed. I thought it was interesting as well to talk about destabilized regions and their autocratic governments. Based on that, though, I think it's really important for us to really examine what autocratic states are we talking about. Are we talking about historically colonized regions that are which is a very complex issue that needs to have its own discussion, and the role of colonialism and imperialism in those regions that cultivated these autocratic governments, and how neocolonialism kind of fares into that. These autocratic nations, again, I'm assuming that it's in the global south, like in Africa or in Asia, for example. They are often indirectly ruled by extraction companies from the global north, exploiting the resource-rich, politically destabilized regions and distracting the global audience that is placing the responsibility on individual autocratic governments or underdevelopment, or sometimes even like racist rhetoric, like their culture or ideologies that are coming out of that region. But really, it's always usually something that is anything other than the rich imperialists who have been controlling these regions for half a millennia. But I think that is starting to change, and colonialism and imperialism is starting to be factored into these discourses of what causes these destabilized regions in the world and how that affects their government systems.
And what are your thoughts on with specific regard to the sort of the connection that I want to say we're seeing, at least I see, and I think others are seeing, about the backsliding of democracy, including the United States, and the simultaneous backsliding of women's rights, women and sexual minority rights. What's your feeling about that?
I have lots to say about that. We talk about democracy in the global north as if it were an imperfect but well-intentioned system created to serve the interests of the masses and enable the liberty and prosperity of the people of its nations. There's this idea that the struggles of these systems is to remove the accidental bias or discrimination against marginalized and oppressed individuals based on the advancement of our ethics or of our ideologies, natural progress. But we have to remember that the history of these states, and a state that was based on the interests of empire, is inherently anti-democratic. Canada and the United States are both nation states based on empire. So when we say democratic backsliding or democratic freedom, when and where are we measuring this from? When we examine the inception and the history of these colonial governments, like Canada's and the United States, whose interests was being served in the creation of these governments and their constitutions, when we study those parts, it's easier to see that this so-called democracy was never, ever democratic. And once we do study these government systems, we realize it's a series of intentional laws and systems to protect the economic interest of resource extraction on the lands that this government is managing and abroad, and that the system is meant to protect the source of labor for those industries the government serves. So that's the masses. And that's where our entire immigration system is actually based on, even to this day. And it's to protect the interests of the owners and benefactors of this economic system. And that's why now the language around political science is political economy, because those two are paired together. And when these governments were first formed, it was by wealthy, white, cis male capitalists. They created these governments to protect their economic interests, and that reality hasn't changed. There was no monumental official moment in history where that was no longer the purpose or intention of these systems. So when we say that we have misogyny or heteropatriarchy, it is just a symptom of these governments that have always existed this way. And we are kind of addressing the symptoms instead of the system itself. And that's why this starts to become more increasingly a problem, because as capitalism, once we understand that the maintenance and advancement of modern capitalism and subsequently global imperialism, we understand what our modern governments are protecting, which is an economic system to serve white cis men under a hierarchical, economic, and subsequently political system. White supremacy, patriarchy, transphobia, homophobia, and poverty are all symptoms of a political economy we are somehow come to believe are democratic. So as capitalism advances and eventually explodes or implodes, because a system based on never-ending growth is literally impossible on this planet, the symptoms of these systems' inherent nature becomes more evident. Late stage capitalism is revealing this political economy for what it is, an exploitation of the masses for the benefits of a few, and this backlash and regression is the beneficiaries of the system trying to protect the thing that protects their interests.
Well, I think that's very true. I think that's the easiest point for my brain to absorb is very much the fact that there is a backlash as the rights of others, sort of non-white male, as you put it, are at least the rights of others are increasing apparently at the expense of, in terms of the perception of the original, perhaps white male group. Carole, I bet you have a lot to say, not only based on what Hafsa just said, but also based on Gabrielle. Help us out.
Yeah, I appreciate both of their contributions up to this point because they're far more eloquent than I could be, and I think much deeper thought. I just want to, I guess, bring your audience into the notion that I'm a lay political geek because I've come to it late in my career. My life has been my professional life has mostly been as a practicing lawyer in private practice in fact, the extraction and energy sectors. And so like hearing what Hafsa has to say resonates with me a lot, in the sense that as a non-male, non-white person living in Canada, I've always felt that there has been a dissonance between our democratic aspirations and rhetoric and what my actual rights and ability to participate are. That being said, I am clearly part of that system too. That's how I make my living, and so it's one of those moments in time where I don't think I'm unique in having to actually face up to the fact that as much as the system, if we want to call it that, oppresses my rights, I am part of that system that is doing that work. And so the question becomes, I think, more not how much we're backsliding democratically, but what can we do to actually bring ourselves to a point where we're actually doing what we were hoping, what our fairy tale world was imagining that we were doing, or what people were telling us that we were doing as a democratic society. Because I think that is probably the key difference between an autocratic state and a non-autocratic state. I won't say democratic state because we've just had this discussion about how democratic is democratic, is that the ability for the non-democratic state elite to actually crush dissent or even transformation of the system is much smaller than what an autocrat has at their disposal. Like an autocrat can do all those things that Gabrielle mentioned earlier on, and they do it well. and the notion. So my heritage is Taiwanese, and my grandfather was a county chief at one point in time. But I know from the stories and the culture that the democratic apparatus was really more of it was an apparatus that was placed there to give people a sense that they had something to say. But in the end, there was still decision makers that were making decisions for everybody else. And so all that to say is, I think this is a moment in time, not just a wake-up call to say, oh, we should protect those rights that we had in democracy, but we should actually build the system we need to have those rights. And I don't know how to do that. I would defer to these lovely and super tooled up guests of yours, Jeff, to answer that question.
Well, you don't think I can help with that? I'm just kidding. I'm totally joking. No, Carole, that's a very good point. And I think and if there is some convergence in what we're talking about, Hafsa, your message was, and forgive me for paraphrasing, but the system was rotten to the core to begin with. So maybe it is a new system that we are talking about. There was a very interesting podcast on The Current a while ago that also blew me away, and it was really talking about the fact that we're not equipped to deal with multicultural societies. That democracy, so to speak, we're usually developed typically in countries that have a very homogeneous population, and Poland would be a great example, right? That would be one criteria, or in a society where there's a clear line of oppression between one group and another, like in the United States. So where do we go from here? Before you answer that, and I'm going to park that with Carole and Gabrielle for a second, I'm going to go back to you, Hafsa. The one issue that I have, and again, I wouldn't say I'm disagreeing with you. I would say I've got my own bias, which you were very clear about in our pre-conversation, and rightfully so, in terms of, I do see a certain amount of democracy in our system, but there have been gains made, right? Are we just kind of throwing out, by saying, well, the system is rotten to the core? What about the gains that were made in the United States with respect to civil rights, or the gain that was made with respect to Roe v. Wade, with RBG? Do we just sort of say, well, the whole system's rotten, so if we see those rights scaling backwards, it doesn't matter because the system's rotten?
That's a great question. So I call it permitted progress, and it's only allowed when it won't disrupt the outcomes of the system in order to entrench the illusion that the system serves the people that are being exploited. The reality is the system relies on oppression and exploitation of the bottom to maintain the hierarchy and hegemony of the top by design. So when there's evidence that even in the history and currently, there's a lot of evidence that governments and courts would find holes that were granting too much democracy to cis women or Black or racialized people, only to fill that democratic hole with oppressive legislation. In the past, it was more obvious because they were inventing a system at that time based on other systems, but they were inventing something new. So there were more obvious episodes of accidental loopholes where women or Black people were owning land, for example, or having access to certain things that would cause them to have a greater mobility in a more fair way. And there would be oppressive legislation that solidified the economic and political hierarchy where these groups couldn't benefit from that democracy. So, for example, with Roe versus Wade, the legislation was created to protect poor women and queer people, and poor queer people. And with 50 years of data post Roe, we can see how monumental Roe versus Wade was to help and protect the most underserved groups, ultimately society as a whole, because crime, for example, went way down. So this law was too effective in undoing the exploitation and suffering of the marginalized people and society as a whole. And this effectiveness ultimately affects the entire system. So, for example, this political economy relies on crime deviance and a police state to protect the interests of the capitalists. Without a police force, the capitalists are completely vulnerable to the masses. So we rely on crime and the narratives around crime and the narratives around the social constructs of crime. And so when we talk about progress and regress, progress that is permanent is only permanent because it serves this political economy and its beneficiaries without disrupting the system. And regression happens when the system is weakened by the progressive legislations like Roe versus Wade, when it was undermining this hierarchy-based system in some way. So regression happens when we find out, this system is accidentally granting too much democracy, and then systems are legislation is put in place. For example, in the civil rights movement, Black and racialized Black people were given the access to the vote, but then their suppression laws, new different kinds of laws were placed in ways that made voting kind of difficult. So even though there is technical progress, there are so many other systems and new legislations that are put in place to undermine that progress that we see and love to chew on and think that is giving us a sense of progress.
Gabrielle, you've been very patient ever since we brought in our two guests. You must be ready to explode with some feedback. So why don't you go ahead and then we'll give Carole the last word.
Okay. No, these are great comments, and I don't disagree. But I'll stick with Churchill on this one and say that democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other one that's been tried. I agree that we're starting from a stack.
That's going to drive Hafsa crazy, by the way, I suspect, but that's okay.
We'll have to continue this conversation.
She's very good at hiding it. That's why it's good to be on YouTube and not only on a podcast. We can actually see each other. Go ahead. Sorry, Gabrielle.
No, it's a critical conversation. In principle, I agree. In practice, the people that I'm working with on a day-to-day basis have immediate needs and are looking to address them with the means that are possible to them within the contexts in which they live. My work is about trying to make democracy function as best as possible for the broadest parts of populations possible by pushing inclusion, by pushing the boundaries and the limits on what the system can offer in trying to shake it, in trying to smash some of these limitations that you have described here. The work that I do in supporting democracy writ large is always done in the framework of trying to smash those barriers as much as possible. Is it possible, ultimately? Maybe, maybe not. But this is the space in which I'm trying to work. And trying to achieve the maximum returns that this system of democracy that we have today is able to offer. No, I've yet to see a perfect democracy. I don't think it exists at all. I think it will always be undermined and limited by the things that you've described. But it's a fight that I'm willing and happy to continue trying for.
Yeah, and I think. What I take away from this cumulative lesson in life, but maybe this conversation has really helped me to see that is, democracy's in the eye of the beholder. The further you are away from the privilege that's associated with living in a democracy, the more you are adversely affected, and the less that current system of democracy really matters. Carole, when I get too cynical, you usually kind of slap me upside the head, sort of, not literally, but proverbially, and you sort of come up with some actionist thoughts about how to turn all that negative into positive. What are you cooking up today?
Well, I think it's actually more thought than action today. I would like to perhaps meet Hafsa and Gabrielle in the middle, because I usually bring out that Churchill quote on Jeff's show. But I was thinking, what are the systems that we've tried? What, like, in Churchill's mind, if you step back into Mr. Churchill's skin and think about, or his brain, and think about the systems that we've tried, those are all patriarchal white male systems. I don't think they sat around and thought about, what is it like to pass around a talking stick or have a women's only led government, because that's how certain Indigenous communities operate. I don't think they, and not to say that those are perfect either. Those have their issues as well. But I don't think that we've perhaps examined every system out there that could better serve the purported goals of a democratic system. And that's not to say we have to throw out democracy. I really am averse to violent revolution because I really don't have time for it. Jeff, you managed to get all the moms on the show who have their kids being babysat by somebody, and I know you have your children as well being cared for. So we don't have time to foment violent. I mean, this group of people perhaps don't have the time nor the inclination to foment violent overthrow of a democratic system. Therefore, I think what we need to do is really demand that not only the people up at the top, the elite who think about this all the time, those of us who show up on podcasts to talk about this, we need to encourage everybody every day to think about what is the goal? Why do I have a government? What do I want it to do with my voice? Or is the government something to do with my voice? Or is it just something that paves the road for me? And I think that's the level that a lot of people see it at. And especially in our society in Canada and the North, we take so much for granted in terms of what our democratic rights, or what our human rights, let's say, are, and how they manifest themselves or are protected or not protected in our government and in our state. And so I think it goes to education. It goes to constant discussion about this, and starting at the level of our kids. I would love if Gabriella goes back to the 2-year-old birthday party and actually has that conversation, because you see that kids understand this. I mean, going back to that commercial, I think it's some bank that does that commercial about how kids know when things are fair and not fair, because they give a candy to the new client and they don't give candies to the old client who's been loyal and whatever forever. They understand that. So it's really not hard to begin that discussion with them. What is hard is to say, okay, there's something not working in our adult world to serve those ideals that we're trying to teach our children and to imbibe infuse in their social morals and consciousness. So what do we, as the adults in the room, what can we do to fix that? Which legislators do we want to write to and work with to actually fix that? And so I guess that's where I leave you, Jeff. I would also just, because I know Hafsa from Moncton, but I would love to just put it out there for Gabriella that anytime she'd like to open up a domestic branch of Herizon Democracy, could be quite interested, because I do think the work is just as important in Northern Euro whatever centric democracies as what you're doing in the rest of the world. So
amazing. I just wanted to close with a couple of comments. One is to say that, I find this podcast a learning process for me. I often start with a certain assumption on how it's going to go, and it gets blown out of the water. And that's really cool, because it really helps my learning in the way I see things. So I want to thank you all for that. Very helpful. Comedic closing. I used to, I've always been very political and very into politics, and I used to sit around with my, family. I have an uncle in particular. I was just laughing about this the other day. I'd be critiquing as a university student, what was happening in Canada at the time, and he would just say, if you don't like it, go to Russia, right? Go live in Russia. And I guess he was right in that sense, right? I am very thankful that I'm not living in Russia, but we can't just throw that, use that as a way of dismissing the changes that we need to make in our democracy and in other democracies. So I want to thank you all very much. Gabrielle Bardall, Hafsa, Mohammad, and Carole Chan. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope to do it again.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for creating this space.
Thank you, Jeff.
Appreciate that. Take care. Wow. As I said just a moment ago, sometimes I start a podcast with a particular idea in mind, and we just end up somewhere completely different. I learned so much from our guests today. Thank you so much to Gabrielle Bardall from Herizon Democracy, Hafsa Mohammad from Grassroots NB, and Carole Chan from Democracy Now! That is our podcast for today. Politics and Public Finance is produced and sponsored by Huge Impact Marketing. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, be sure to subscribe. I'm Jeff Dubrow. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.